All right, this is the final word. If you've reading my book, A Meaning-Based Approach to Reading Instruction, this expands on the final word described in the chapter on dyslexia. So let's take a look at some ideas. Now, there are 7 elements necessary for effective reading instruction. During the week, students should engage in some or all of these activities: daily reading practice, social interaction and conversation around and about good books, authentic writing activities where they are writing their ideas, activity and instruction to help students recognize words, develop their ability to recognize words automatically while they're reading. That means we are developing all 3 cueing systems, not just phonics, but the syntactic and semantic cueing systems. Activities and instruction for word identification. Word identification is different from recognition. Strategy is something you consciously employ. Comprehension instruction, it's a strategy you consciously employ, but it's a skill if you are developing cognitive processes. And activities related to vocabulary. Now, depending on the students, some students need more, some students need less of some things, but all students need all of these things in some form and fashion. Now, sadly, what often happens with struggling readers is they get a whole bunch of number 4 and more number 4, and we hit them over the head with number 4, and we think that's going to make them better readers. That's going to help them catch up. But guess what? They never catch up. And in the meantime, they learn to hate reading because we've made it so miserable. We need to engage students in daily reading practice. Reading is fun. It is a pleasurable experience. A teacher's number 1 job is to help children fall in love with books. Now, effective reading interventions are more intense versions of classroom reading instruction, more intense versions of that. Back in my day, we had what's called DISTAR. Students would take reading class in my class, have reading class, and then if you were a struggling reader, we'd send you down the hall for a little bit more DISTAR. And that creates a splintered curriculum, because what you were doing in my class is different from what they were experiencing down in the DISTAR room. So it splinters off. It would be like learning to play tennis, and someone shows you how to swing the racket one way in the morning, and you take instruction from another person and they show you how to swing the racket a different way in the afternoon. It would be splintered, and it would make learning to play tennis harder. More intense versions of what is occurring, of good classroom instruction, more intense versions of that. And that doesn't mean just more of number 4, which often happens. Intensity means more time, and therein is the rub. They need more time for reading class. Okay, what are you going to pull them out of? Spelling, health, social studies? More time on task, that means they're engaged versus sitting passively. They're doing things. And by the way, direct instruction, too often they're sitting passively, they're not engaged. Direct instruction is important. It is one pedagogical strategy. We need to limit the input and use guided practice to get them actively engaged. More time engaged in authentic literacy experiences. That means reading books that they have selected, reading silently and not round-robin oral reading, and writing for real purposes, expressing their thoughts, their ideas. And then smaller groups, 3 to 7. That is intensity. That's what we mean by more intense versions. 6 elements of a reading intervention. Effective reading interventions should have writing. And by the way, how many of these depends on the student's specific needs. That's why we do diagnostics, to find out what the deficit areas are. Is it word identification? Is it fluency? Is it comprehension? Is it all of them? And if you're writing an IEP, you have IEP goals specifically related to the deficit area. So you should have one goal for fluency, one goal for comprehension, if that's a problem, and one goal for word identification. 98% of IEPs related to reading are incorrectly written. All right, writing of some sort, yes, we saw that in instruction. Word work, yes. Close and maze activities are related to word work. These are the activities that develop the semantic cueing system. And writing is used for the syntactic cueing system. Fluency activities, cognitive processes related to comprehension and high-level thinking, and self-selected reading practice. Now, if a student is struggling just with word identification, well, they maybe do just 1, 2, and 3. If the student is doing just fine with that and is struggling with comprehension, well, maybe a lot of number 5 and 6. Maybe word identification is good, comprehension is good, but fluent, then you would do number 4 if fluency is an issue. But of course, reading practice enhances everything. So everything should include reading practice, no matter what the deficit area. These 6 elements in some form depending on the deficit area. Now, a couple things about dyslexia, things that people misunderstand, understand, or get wrong. Everybody believes that interventions are important. It's not the what of early interventions, it's the what form. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all program. Things like Orton-Gillingham are a one-size-fits-all program, and they do not fit all. Students who enter kindergarten without a lot of book reading or conversation or exposure to print are going to be behind those who have had a lot of experience. This doesn't mean they're at risk for dyslexia. It just means they need to have more book reading experience and exposure to good books. Reading is a pleasurable act. That's why Head Start programs and Early Start programs are so important. And again, if they enter kindergarten without a lot of book reading and conversation, yes, they're going to score lower on tests of phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is a effect, not a cause. It's an effect. Having high scores on phonemic awareness is an effect of this book reading experience. Short-term blips. Do not mistake short-term blips for progress. What a blip usually means is that you taught something, you measured that something you taught, and you found more of that something you taught after having taught it. But the questions are, as a result of the holy blip, are students better able to create meaning with print? And that's what reading is. It is a meaning-making endeavor. Over time, is the blip-making program more effective than reading and talking about good books, writing and sharing ideas, and learning skills in authentic context? And that's always the question. Any exposure to print is helpful. Even exposure to silly blip-making programs has some impact, but the question always comes back to this. Is blip making more impactful than meaning making? That's the question. And do these blip making programs like Orton-Gillingham help children fall in love with books? Exposure to print. A lot of the research, and I've kind of said to this, has children doing programs and compares something to something else. Any exposure to print has some impact. Even meaningless skills-based programs have some impact. But are the skills-based programs more effective than meaning-based programs? And that is the comparison we have to make. A lot of the research compares skills-based programs to some distorted version of a meaning-based program or of a whole language program, or has groups that are not comparable. For example, you cannot compare private schools to public schools because the sample sizes are different. The samples are different. The subjects are different. The private school is a self-selected population. The public school, anyone can get on the bus. That's just one example of trying to make comparisons to groups that are not comparable. Any comparison that's made between skills-based program and something else has to have comparable groups, comparable instruction. Direct instruction. Everybody believes in direct instruction. It's not the what, it's the how and the how much and for what purpose. Direct instruction is a pedagogical strategy, one of many to be used. It is not a method to be used exclusively. And that's what often happens with struggling readers. They just get a whole bunch of direct instruction of low-level skills. And if only low-level skills are taught, only low-level learning occurs. Being a direct instruction expert does not make you a reading instruction expert. Now, in the state of Minnesota, the federal legislatures declared that if you were a special education teacher, you were a reading expert. And I take umbrage to this, of course, because overnight, with the stroke of a pen, a whole bunch of people became reading experts. When you look at the standards required for being a special ed teacher and being a reading specialist or even an elementary ed teacher, there are far more literacy standards required of an elementary teacher than a special ed teacher. A whole bunch of assessment and direct instruction in special ed. Being a direct instruction expert does not make you a reading expert. Reading experts understand literacy learning and a wide variety of strategies related to literacy learning. All right, expert teachers. So this is kind of what I was talking about. Struggling readers need our most expert teachers. They need to be able to use, and teachers, these expert reading teachers, need to be able to use their expertise to make decisions about their students, because expert teachers know their students. I don't know their students. We shouldn't be requiring these expert teachers to implement programs with fidelity, to follow the recipe exactly. That's an example of educational malpractice. To implement a program without consideration to your students' specific needs. Fidelity, following the recipe exactly, is important in conducting research where you have control and experimental groups. But children are not bacteria in a petri dish. They're real human beings. So you need to adopt and adapt any program that you use to meet the needs of your students and your specific teaching strengths. We need expert reading teachers, and expert reading teachers have 4 kinds of knowledge. Expert reading teachers of any kind. They have content knowledge. Good math teachers know a lot about math. Good reading teachers know a lot about reading. Elementary ed teachers have to be kind of experts in a lot of things. Pedagogical knowledge, that's knowledge of basic teaching strategies, like cooperative learning and thinking skills and discovery learning. These are pedagogical strategies. Pedagogical content knowledge are strategies related to specific subjects or areas. In our case, we are looking for teaching strategies related to reading. Expert reading teachers have a whole bunch of strategies for teaching reading. Their teaching toolbox is filled with teaching tools. Not simply following the directions, but a whole bunch of tools. Not just direct instruction, but a whole bunch of tools, because kids are different, classes are different. And the last one, expert teachers have knowledge of learners and learning. learners, their developmental needs, how learning occurs, and the learning process. Part of this is the reading process. How does the brain create meaning with print? How do children learn the language, learn to speak, learn to write, learn to read, learn to listen? How does this occur? How do they acquire language? How do they learn to speak? How do they learn to read, listen? How do they learn? How does the human brain learn? This is what an expert teacher is. And by the way, we do not create expert teachers in 4 semesters of any teacher preparation program. Get that out of your head. Not even close. That's an insult to the master teachers. Being and becoming an expert teacher occurs over time. And the most expert of expert teachers, the magical teachers I've had the privilege to encounter, are those teachers that are continuing to learn until the day they retire. They're interested. They're still reading books and journal articles and finding out stuff. Those are the magic teachers. In the journey of teaching mastery, if you think you're there, you're not even close. I've been at this for over 37 years, and I still am not close to where I think I should be to be a master teacher. I'm getting closer. But by the way, it's not the place you're at on the path, it's the direction you're facing. We're all in different places in our journey towards being and becoming an expert teacher. It's the direction we're moving. All right, enough said about that. Off on a tangent, sorry. Systematic phonics. Everybody agrees that systematic phonics in some form is needed. But who gets to decide the system and the form? Somebody from New York City who doesn't know your students? No, you should. Your students are your scope and sequence. This idea that you start at one end of a scope and sequence chart and march in lockstep towards the end, that's silly because it doesn't reflect how human beings learn, and it's an example of educational malpractice because students don't learn that way. We don't learn in lines. It's a Humpty Dumpty approach where they've taken the act of reading, they've broken it into a bunch of little parts, and they're saying to our little students, put all these little parts together again, put Humpty Dumpty together again, and at the end, you'll be able to read. That's not how human beings learn. That's part to whole instruction. We learn best from whole to part, by being engaged in an authentic activity and learning skills within that context. By being engaged in authentic reading activities and learning skills within that context. But they can't read, you say, in kindergarten. Every child can read in kindergarten. Absolutely. They may use more picture clues than letter clues, but they can open that book and they can tell you that story. So within the context of that, that's where instruction begins in preschool and kindergarten, learning their letter sounds and their sight words, and then they began more formal instruction in first grade. Everyone believes in systematic phonics. It's who gets to decide on the system and the form. And I say expert reading teachers should decide on the system and the form. Research-based instruction. Everybody agrees that a wide body of peer-reviewed research should be used to make decisions about reading instruction and intervention. But who gets to make the decisions about what counts as research? The U.S. Department of Education? But they don't know a lot about educational research, obviously. The Council of Exceptional Children, they discount a whole bunch of research. The National Reading Panel, same thing. They started with a preconceived idea. The National Reading Panel looked for only a very narrow bit of research that supported their original ideas. They threw out a whole bunch of stuff. This idea that controlled experimental research is the exclusive way to determine causality is preposterous. That demonstrates a limited understanding of educational research. Controlled experimental research is when you try to control all the variables except one to determine causality. But in the classroom, once you start controlling the variables, the reality you're seeking to examine becomes non-reality. Meaning, a lot of these experiments in education aren't realistic. They aren't what happened. Pulling a kid out of the classroom for extensive instruction by a specially trained research assistant, well, that doesn't happen in a classroom. We're not able to do individual direct instruction with all our struggling readers. We'd like to, but that's non-reality. They're controlling all the variables, and they want you then to replicate their research-based program with fidelity, even though they can control the variables and you can't. So controlled experimental research, quantitative research, is important. It's a valuable tool. It's the exclusive use of that to the exclusion of all else that causes what we call a peephole view of reality. It creates numbers, and numbers without context, without understanding, lead to the great ununderstanding of reading and the reading process. All right, we have looked at 7 areas. This is the final word. I leave you now, and I wish you the very best. What we do is so incredibly important. We can change the world one kid at a time. We are powerful entities in that respect.